Herb Cawthorne, a teacher, elected official, news commentator, and political activist, has presented the words of Dr. Martin Luther King for nearly 40 years. He captures the voice and vernacular of Dr. King and makes his words come alive, like when Dr. King remembered the beginning of the movement.
One day, after finishing school, I was called to a little church down in Montgomery, Alabama. I started preaching in that church. Things were going well in that church. It was a marvelous experience. One day, about a year later, a lady by the name of Rosa Parks decided she wasn't going to take it any longer. She stayed in a bus seat. And you may not remember it because it's way back now, several years, but it was the beginning of a movement where 50,000 black men and women refused absolutely to ride the city buses, and we walked together for 381 days. That's what we got to learn in the North. Negroes got to learn to stick together. We stuck together. We sent out the call. No Negro rode the city buses. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life. The black people of Montgomery asked me to serve as the spokesman and as the president of the new organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, that came into being to lead the boycott. I couldn't say no.
Through Cawthorne's outstanding presentation, Dr. King comes alive for young and old alike who may have never heard his words. Now Herb Cawthorne is available to bring from the pulpit to the people, to your campus, church, or organization. Don't miss a chance to experience this powerful performance that takes us back to those challenging days, including Dr. King's last public speech in Memphis.
Thank you very kindly, my friends. As I listen to Ralph Abernathy and his eloquent and generous introduction, and then thought about myself, I wondered who he was talking about. It's always nice to have your closest friend and associate to say something good about you. And Ralph Abernathy is the best friend that I have in the world. I'm delighted to see each of you here tonight in spite of a storm warning. You reveal that you are determined to go on anyhow. Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. And you know, if I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek through the dark dungeons of Egypt, across the Red Sea, through the wilderness and on toward the Promised Land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would even come on up by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus. And I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon. And I would watch them as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even go by the way of the great heyday of the Roman Empire. And I would get a great picture of the developments around there through various emperors and leaders, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the Renaissance and get a quick picture of all that the Renaissance did for the cultural and aesthetic life of man. But I wouldn't stop there. I would even go by the way that the man for whom I'm named had his habitat. And I would watch Martin Luther as he tacks his 95 Theses on the door of the church at Wittenberg. But I wouldn't stop there. I would even come on up to 1863. And I would watch a vacillating president by the name of Abraham Lincoln finally come to the conclusion that he had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. But I wouldn't stop there. I would come on up even to the early 30s and see a man grappling with the problems of the bankruptcy of his nation, and come with an eloquent cry that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But I wouldn't stop there. Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty, and I would say, if you would allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now, that's a strange statement to make. The world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But somehow I know that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I can see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men in some strange way are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free.
Bring this magnificent learning opportunity to your college, university, church, or community organization as a way to ignite the spirit of Dr. King and remind us of his brilliance, his courage, and his commitment to human rights and equality. Consider the emotionally uplifting conclusion to his speech in Memphis on April 3, 1968, his last public words before he was assassinated the next day.
Now, it really doesn't matter what happens now. And they were telling me, it really doesn't matter what happens now. It really doesn't matter. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane this morning, and to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would go wrong on the plane, we've had to check out everything carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then we got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats or talk about the threats that were out or what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Well, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you, But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
This is a learning experience that will never be forgotten, as several of Dr. King's speeches are woven together in 70 minutes of historic energy. In the Beginning is just one example, a sermon by Dr. King in which he outlines the spiritual challenges of the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955.
As I said before, we sent out the call. No Negro rode the city buses. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life. The black people of Montgomery asked me to serve as the spokesman and as the president of the new organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, that came into being to lead the boycott. I couldn't say no. Then we started our struggle together. Things were going well for the first few days. But then about 10 or 15 days later, after the white people of Montgomery knew that we meant business, they started doing some nasty things. They started making nasty telephone calls. And some days more than 40 telephone calls would come in, threatening my life, the life of my family, the life of my children. I took it for a while in a strong manner. But I never will forget one night, very late. It was around midnight, and you can have some strange experiences at midnight. I had been out meeting with the steering committee all that day, and I got home. The wife was in the bed, and immediately I crawled into bed to try to get some rest, to get up early the next morning to keep things going, and immediately the telephone started ringing, and I picked it up. On the other end was an ugly voice. And that voice said to me in substance, "Nigger, we're tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house." Well, I'd heard these things before, but for some reason that night it got to me. I turned over and I tried to go to sleep, but I couldn't sleep. I was frustrated, bewildered. And so I got up and went back to the kitchen and started warming some coffee, thinking that coffee might give me a little relief. And I sat down over that cup of coffee. I never will forget it. And I sat there and thought about many things. I pulled back on the philosophy and the theology I had just studied in the universities, trying to give philosophical and theological reasons for the existence and the reality of sin and evil, but the answer didn't quite come there. I sat there and thought about a beautiful little daughter who had just been born a month earlier. We have 4 children now, but we only had 1 then. She was the darling of my life. I'd come in night after night and see that little gentle smile. And I thought about that little girl and the fact that she could be taken away from me any minute. I sat there and thought about a dedicated, devoted, and loyal wife who was over there asleep. She could be taken from me, or I could be taken from her, and I got to the point where I just couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. Something said to me, "You can't call on Daddy now. He's up in Atlanta, 175 miles away. You can't even call on Mama now. You got to call on that person that your daddy used to tell you about. That power that can make a way out of no way." And I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. And I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. It seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. Stand up for righteousness, and lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the world. I tell you, I've seen the lightning flash. I've heard the thunder roar. I've felt sin breakers dashing, trying to conquer my soul, but I heard the voice of Jesus saying still to fight on. He promised never to leave me alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me alone. No, never alone. Sometimes I feel discouraged. Sometimes I feel discouraged. I felt discouraged in Chicago. As I moved through Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, I feel discouraged sometimes. Living every day under extensive criticism, even from Negroes, I feel discouraged sometimes. Living every day under the threat of death, I feel discouraged sometimes. Yes, sometimes I feel discouraged and feel my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There's a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There's a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul.
The presentation concludes with Eulogy, a sermon by Dr. King several weeks before he was shot and killed, in which he talks eloquently about his own death and what he wants people to say about him when he has to meet his Maker.
Every now and then, I guess we all think realistically about that day when we will be victimized with what is life's final common denominator. That's something we call death. We all think about it, and every now and then I think about my own death, and I think about my own funeral, but I don't think of it in a morbid sense. And every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I would want said? And I leave the word to you this morning. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. And every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to be able to say on that day that I did try to be right on the wool question. I want you to be able to say on that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say on that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to be able to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. And I want you to be able to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. Say that I was a drum major for righteousness, and all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind, but I just want to leave a committed life behind, and that's all I want to say. If I can help somebody, if as I pass along, I can cheer somebody with a word or song, I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. Yes, Jesus, I want to be on your right or your left side. I want to be on your right or your left side, not in terms of some personal ambition. I want to be on your right or your left side, not in terms of some personal political kingdom. I just want to be there in truth and in justice and in righteousness, so that we might make of this old world a new world. God bless you.
Act quickly. Take this opportunity to bring From the Pulpit to the People, the spirit and words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to your campus or organization. Contact Herb Cawthorne at hlcawthorne@cox.net. That's H.L. Cawthorne. Cawthorne spelled Cawthorne, or call area code 619-977-6480.